So today I'm going to be talking about low overhead fault tolerance for universal quantum computation, or in much simpler terms, how do we implement quantum algorithms with error correction? So this research is in the field of quantum science and technology, which is really about how we store, transmit, and manipulate information once we get to really small and quantum length scales. And at these length scales, light and matter begin to obey the laws of quantum mechanics. So we need to think about and take into account quantum effects such as superposition, where we have an object existing simultaneously in multiple states at once, and entanglement, where we can have superposition states that have non-local or non-classical correlations. And my research is in the field of quantum computing, which is a type of computer that leverages these quantum effects in order to process information in really fundamentally different ways than classical computers like your laptop. And to be a bit more concrete, when we think about classical computers, we store information there in the form of bits or just binary sequences of zeros and ones. And then we can do computation by manipulating those bits with gates such as and or not. And taking this over to the quantum setting, we'll be storing information in quantum bits or qubits, where we can have some two-level system with two states, 0 and 1, and it can exist in any superposition of the two. So here, some of you might be familiar with this diagram. It's a block sphere showing all the possible superposition states that we can prepare. And when we do computation with quantum bits, we will manipulate them not using classical gates, but rather using unitary gates, which is kind of the most fundamental law that quantum mechanical systems have to obey. They have to evolve unitarily. And the real power of quantum computers comes in once we start scaling them to more and more qubits. So if I think of the wave function of an n-qubit state, it'll have 2 to the n complex coefficients corresponding to each possible combination of zeros and ones that can exist in that superposition. And in certain applications, this can actually give you an advantage if you can really leverage it. And so, as I mentioned, certain applications quantum computers are really good for. And there's a few that I just want to mention. So a big one is cryptography. Quantum computers are really good at factoring numbers, but I think more interestingly is just their ability to simulate quantum mechanics itself. So because of this 2 to the n coefficients, quantum mechanics is very complicated to simulate. But if we want to study chemical systems that have interesting quantum effects or simulate materials, we need to account for these. And this is kind of what quantum computers just do naturally. And the current state of the field is that there's many platforms for processing quantum information. So basically any system where you have a reasonably isolated two-level system that will make a qubit will do. And I just have a few of them highlighted here. So for example, ions, neutral atoms, and superconducting qubits are just a few of the main examples. And the name of the game here currently is to scale these devices so that we can do more interesting and complex computations. And this is actually a major engineering challenge. And this is because there's a really fundamental trade-off in between two aspects. So controllability, the ability to manipulate these qubits and do evolution and gates on them with high fidelity. And the other is scalability. So how do we get more and more computational power while maintaining this controllability? And so the real current frontier of the field is to scale these devices in order to build bigger and better quantum machines. But it's also to understand how do we implement these interesting algorithms in practice. And it turns out that this is a major challenge that I'll be talking about today. So the central challenge is really that as we scale these quantum platforms in order to run larger and larger computations, we have to suppress errors as we do this. So those of you with some familiarity with quantum mechanics know that quantum systems are inherently fragile. They need to be isolated from their environment, otherwise you'll just destroy this delicate superposition. And It's really been kind of a major engineering feat that devices today have error rates per operation that are around 10 to the minus 2 or 10 to the minus 3. And it's quite exciting that we've been able to reach these levels. But on the other hand, these error rates are actually super far away from what we need in practice. So these large-scale problems, such as factoring, for example, need billions of operations in order to run the algorithm to completion. And as a result, you need gates to have an error rate that is the inverse of that, essentially. So 10 to the minus 10 and below. And quantum error correction is really the only known realistic route to suppress gate errors to the levels that we need. So we don't really expect to be able to build this perfect quantum physical device that can get these super low error rates. We expect to have to do some sort of error correction itself. And that will be kind of the topic that I'll be talking about today. I should also mention, please ask any questions, because I know that there are a lot of people with different backgrounds in the audience. So I'm really happy to answer anything. Okay, so let's talk about quantum error correction. So initially, people thought that quantum error correction, and therefore quantum computing as a whole, would actually just be fundamentally impossible. And the reason is that it works very differently than classical error correction. So when we think about classical error correction, the example you might be familiar with is a repetition codes, where we're using redundancy to encode information. In the quantum setting, we already have a pretty fundamental roadblock if we try and do this, which is the so-called no cloning theorem that says you can't copy quantum information. And so it was really a theoretical breakthrough that allowed us to get around this limitation and protect quantum information. So the basic idea is that we are going to encode a protected logical qubit in many physical qubits by basically using entanglement to delocalize this logical information that we're trying to protect in order to make it very hard for local physical errors to manipulate our state. And to understand this a bit better, we can kind of draw an analogy to classical error correction. So in classical error correction, we use, say, a repetition code to redundantly encode bits. And if we want to detect an error and correct it, we'll just look at the bits in order to do a majority vote and correct our state. And you can try and think about doing this in the quantum setting as well, redundantly encoding a logical state as a sequence of zeros or ones. But we already reached kind of a fundamental difficulty that says that we need to do things differently when we think about how to correct errors in this setting. So suppose I have a superposition of logical 0 and 1, and I want to figure out what errors occurred. I can't just go ahead and look at my qubits, because if I did that, I would collapse this huge superposition state that I have. So there's a way to get around this, and this is by not looking at the individual qubits, but rather looking at parities of qubits. So instead of measuring qubits, we'll measure parities, which are basically comparisons in the operators of different qubits. Okay, what does that mean? In the case of this repetition code example, I'll look at adjacent qubits, and I'll look to see if they match or if they don't match by measuring their Z operators in this case. And if they don't match, I know one of the two qubits in that comparison has an error. So this actually works well to detect bit flip errors. But in quantum mechanics, of course, we have this whole block sphere of errors that we have. And this actually doesn't work to detect another type of error that we need to worry about, which is phase flip errors or Pauli Z type errors. And the way that you can see this is that basically, if I have a Z error occur on this state, I'll flip the phase between logical 0 and logical 1 and make it logical 0 minus logical 1. Yes, question.
What is the Z operator?
Z operator. Okay, great. Are you familiar with Pauli operators?
No.
Okay, sounds good. You can think of it as, also this is a great question because I can explain these things more now if I know that people don't understand. So a qubit lives in this space of 0, 1 and any superposition of 0 and 1. And a Pauli X operator is just an operation on the state of this space that will flip 0 and 1. A Pauli Z operator is kind of an orthogonal operator that will, instead of flipping 0 and 1, it'll flip 0 plus 1 to 0 minus 1.
Is it like complex conjugation on the block sphere?
You can think of it as it'll kind of flip you around the block sphere. Let me see if I can. Yeah. So X will take you from the top to the bottom. This will take you from right to left. That makes sense. Any more questions also? Cool. All right, please ask questions because, yeah, I want to make sure everyone understands. Okay, so as I mentioned, so this repetition code will detect bit flip errors. It does not detect phase flip errors. And again, you can see this because if I have the phase of one of these zeros or ones flip, it'll make it logical 0 minus 1 instead of logical 0 plus 1. And that's effectively doing an operation on our logical qubit, which we just can't detect. It's already an error, and it's unrecoverable in a sense. So how are we able to protect against both types of errors? The most famous example of this is called a surface code. This was kind of a paradigmatic quantum correction code. And you can think of it as a product of two repetition codes. One whose job is to detect bit flip errors. The other whose job it is to detect phase flip errors. So the surface code looks like this here on the left. So it's a grid of physical qubits that encodes a single logical qubit. And the dimension of the surface code is given by the code, it's called the code distance D. And you can think of it as we'll see, roughly characterizing how many errors we can correct or not. So as it grows, we'll be able to correct more errors. I'll get into that in a second. So the vertices here on this grid are the physical qubits, and then this tiled pattern that you see is these so-called stabilizer operators, which are basically encoding these parity measurements that we're using to detect incorrect errors. So we'll have two types of stabilizers. An X stabilizer is a product of Pauli X operators on our individual physical qubits. And our Z stabilizer is a product of Pauli Z operators on our physical qubit. And you can think of this as encoding, you can think of these stabilizers as being able to detect errors for us. So in particular, an X stabilizer is going to detect Z errors, a Z stabilizer will detect errors. So how does this work? Well, if I have a X or bit flip error on one of my physical qubits, it will, you can think of it under quantum mechanics as basically flipping the measurement of any stabilizers that anti-commute with this operator. And so if we define our error-free state as having all stabilizers equal to +1, if we see two of these stabilizers flip to -1, we know that we've had a physical X error happen in this spot. Any questions so far? So in general, if I have my logical qubit and it's interacting with the environment, I could have many physical errors happen. And the pattern of -1 error detections I'm going to get is pretty complicated. And in general, what I will do is when I measure my stabilizers in order to figure out what error occurs, I will take those measurements and I'm just going to feed it into a classical algorithm that I'm going to run on a normal computer. And the job of that algorithm is to infer from those measurements what errors could have happened in order to correct and undo them. And this is just to handle the complexity of correcting these errors in practice. So the most important fundamental theorem of quantum error correction is called the threshold theorem. And this is really the key theorem that allows errors to be corrected in a scalable way. So what it basically says is that as I grow the code distance or the size of my lattice, I have more opportunities for physical errors because I'm introducing more qubits, but I also gain more stabilizers. And the power of these additional stabilizer checks actually, it overcomes the additional physical errors that you add in a way that allows you to reduce the likelihood that you actually have a logical error exponentially in your code distance. So just by increasing the lattice size by a little, you get a ton more protection. And this is possible as long as your physical error probability P is below some threshold error rate. And this threshold error rate for the surface code is actually super high. It's around 1%, which can be realized in many physical devices today and actually has recently. And so this, once you're kind of below this threshold error rate, you have a very realistic route to make your logical error probability super low. 10 to the minus 10, for example. Yeah, question.
So you're getting kind of savings by like growing your grid just a little bit gives you exponential savings. But then kind of when you're going to classically compute on a computer, like
what error occurred?
Or yeah, because you say
decoding algorithm.
The decoding algorithm,
yeah,
right? How like you actually have to like classically do that. So is there, I guess there's a trade-off there as well, but I guess how fast does that compare to the savings you get?
This is a great question, and it's something that people argue about all the time in the field. Because the basic, okay, it's a great question. The basic idea is that as I'm doing my computation, I'm gonna have errors occur, and I need to interpret, if I measure a logical qubit, I need to interpret its value in order to, use that information. But there's kind of two things. Like, one is if your decoder is not fast enough to keep up with the computation, your quantum computer is going to have to wait until the classical algorithm figures out what's going on. And that's a huge issue because quantum computers get noisy really fast. So that's one thing. So you need a fast algorithm, basically. Yeah, and I guess I'll leave it at that. Does that make sense?
Guys, can you say a little more? Where does this P threshold come from? Like, what goes into that calculation, or is it an empirical value? Or
very good question. Let me think. There's kind of two answers. So the kind of physics intuition is that at a very intuitive level, suppose that I have my code and I have some errors happening. And around those errors, I'll have stabilizers flip to -1 that detect it. But if I have too high of an error rate, it's going to be very difficult to kind of distinguish these errors from a logical operation itself. And so when I fix the state back to having all stabilizers +1, I could accidentally apply a logical operation instead of just flipping these stabilizers locally back to +1. And so actually there's a lot of physics arguments about like percolation thresholds of lattices, for example, on the surface code that you can derive these from first principles. In practice, though, people just simulate it with a classical computer and figure out what it is.
So, but it's a function of the code you use ultimately,
Yeah.
the choice of the code, and then, but it's not a function of like the algorithms ultimately that you're running on it.
Great question. Usually it's just the first thing.
Yeah.
It's what every code has a different threshold. Every error model has a different threshold.
Oh, yes.
Some people have really correlated noise and that can mess it up.
Ah, okay. Gotcha. Great.
Yeah. And depending on how you try to run the algorithm, maybe you do it in a really bad way and you make a ton of noise accumulate, and that's also bad.
Right. Okay, cool.
But in most settings for the surface code, unless you're doing something almost intentionally wrong, you're going to get this 1% number. Yeah. More questions? Yeah.
So if this lattice is like ancilla qubits, are you like running a circuit on it, or like where are these X and P's?
Oh, great question. So I'll get to it in a bit, but I think this is a great time to just answer your question. So I think maybe to rephrase your question, you're asking, how do I measure these stabilizers? Super good question. So in practice, in a lot of physical systems, we're not able to measure these complicated four body operators. We can just read out individual physical qubits. And so what you do is you basically bring in an extra qubit for each one of these stabilizers. And that extra qubit is going to do gates that basically map this product of four X's onto the value of that extra qubit. You're going to use a quantum circuit to map it on to the extra qubit, and then you're going to read out the extra qubit, which will tell you is this plus or minus one. Yeah. Yeah. Any more questions? Great. All right.
So that's a mini oracle.
Yeah, it's an
Right, you add a
oracle.
bit and you can, but then are you doing it? Is that unitary or it is?
Yeah, and the way you can maybe think of it is the following. So let's say I'm trying to I can show you an example of the circuit in a few slides actually, but maybe to just describe it, oops, I'll keep doing that. So if I want to measure Z, 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 I want to know if the product of zeros, if the parity of the zeros and ones on those four qubits is even or odd, basically. And you can do this by basically doing a gate that control flips your extra qubit, yeah. All right. So let's go into the challenges of realizing these computations in practice. So on one hand, there are immense hardware challenges that are due to the fact that it is very difficult to control qubits. So when we think about a classical computer, you have billions of bits, and they are all being controlled by roughly 1,000 wires, whose job it is to kind of orchestrate the computation by sending voltages that will flip your bits if you want them. But when people have been designing quantum computers, they've really focused on controlling individual physical qubits. And in order to do that, you can think of it as you need one wire per physical qubit, which means if you need millions of physical qubits to run an algorithm, you all of a sudden need millions of wires, which is just insane. It's impractical. So this wiring problem is a huge issue when we think about scalability. So a lot of systems today have 100 qubits, physical qubits. That's maybe manageable, but as we scale, it's going to become a problem. The second challenge that we have to worry about when we think about actually doing a computation is that once a logical qubit is delocalized among its many physical qubits, it actually becomes, it becomes difficult for errors to corrupt the state, but it also becomes very difficult to intentionally manipulate the logical state in order to do gates. And so these two challenges have made it such that until very recently, most proof of principle demonstrations of error correction have been focused on one or two logical qubits and gates, which is a lot smaller than what we need to run algorithms. So that's one challenge. The other challenge is due to just the inherent resources that we need to do error correction in practice. So these come in two flavors. One is space. We're delocalizing a logical qubit among many physical qubits. If you want more and more protection, you need to make your code bigger and bigger. And some of these really large algorithms require hundreds to even roughly 1,000 physical qubits per logical qubit. It's horrible. There's also an issue with time. As I mentioned, these gates are really difficult to do. It's very difficult to control these qubits. And as a result, the time it takes to do a logical gate is a lot longer than what it takes to do a physical gate. And people have done resource estimates on what are the amount of physical qubits in millions that I need and the runtime here in seconds to run various applications, and the numbers are just astronomical. I mean, you're talking about millions of physical qubits and potentially even a year. So really the key frontier is how do we close the gap between hardware, which currently is not even on the spot, but it may be soon, and these really interesting applications that we want to run. And we can do this by making the hardware better, but also as theorists, we can try and make error correction more efficient. And both of these elements are really crucial. So, okay, I'm gonna go a little bit slower through my talk than I was initially planning, but I think it's great because there's more pictures in the first half, which I like. So I'll start by talking about experiments in my group that are exploring quantum error correction with neutral atoms in practice. And then if there's time, I'll talk about how we can significantly reduce the overhead of quantum error correction, which will enable, hopefully, experiments to be done more easily in the future. So the platform that my group is working on is that of a reconfigurable neutral atom array. What does this mean? We're going to take a bunch of rubidium atoms and cool them down, and each atom is going to store a single qubit in the state of its outermost valence electron. So the 0 and 1 states are going to be in two low-lying states of our electron, which are nice because they're really protected from the environment, long coherence times. And then if we want to do a gate between our two atoms in order to entangle them, we'll excite the electron up using a laser to a really highly excited electronic state called a Rydberg state. And any nearby atoms that are both in this state are going to interact, and they are going to become entangled. And this will realize the native gate in the platform, which is called a CZ gate, which is basically going to apply a Z operator onto one qubit if the other qubit was in the one state. So it entangles the two qubits. And this platform has some really unique opportunities for quantum error correction that were developed in my group while I was doing my PhD. And the one that I really want to stress is that of non-local connectivity that can be really efficiently classically controlled. So basically, we have the ability to pick up a group of qubits all in parallel and then reconfigure them during the computation and move them around. And this is nice because when we want to do gates, we need to put two atoms closely to each other so they can interact. And if we can rearrange them, we can have kind of all-to-all gate connectivity between our atoms. And this is actually super useful in the context of quantum error correction, which I'll describe. So here's an example of how this non-local connectivity looks like in practice. So this image here is a circuit that's being run that's going to prepare a toric code state closely related to the surface code, just periodic boundary conditions. And it's showing a key quantum error correcting primitive called syndrome extraction, which was related to a question earlier, where basically we're going to prepare a toric code state in logical 0, for example, by basically using ancilla qubits, which are the ones that are zooming around, in order to do a circuit with our data qubits. So each time two data qubits interact, they're doing a CZ gate. And the result of this circuit and these 4 CZ gates will map the value of my stabilizer onto the ancilla qubit so we can read it out and project into an entangled state. So the key thing that I want to emphasize here is that this circuit is really easily programmed in practice. So basically, we control the X and Y positions of the atoms using 2 voltages. And we do this all in parallel over our many physical qubits. So this non-local control is also useful for doing logic gates. So I mentioned that logic gates are in general hard because we have this delocalized quantum information that we want to somehow manipulate. But it actually becomes really easy in certain cases if you have non-locality. So in particular, what we can do is a type of logic gate called a transversal gate that basically, It works by directly interacting these delocalized degrees of freedom in order to do a gate. So if we want to realize a transversal C0 or entangling gate, we'll basically interlace two logical qubits, and then we'll pulse the laser in order to do a physical C0 gate between the individual pairs of physical qubits. And this will effectively realize a logical C0. So the definition of a transversal gate is just, I'll do a logical operation by applying the same operation to all my physical qubits. So super easy, just a single step. This has many benefits. The first is that it's inherently fault tolerant. Fault tolerant, just a jargon word, it just means that errors are not going to spread within the block. This is because we're not doing any gates between the blocks, so it's really robust against errors. The other is that we can realize these gates using this long-range connectivity, and furthermore, by moving atoms, we can do entangling gates between any pairs of logical qubits that we want. And finally, I want to emphasize that here we have single logical qubit control rather than single physical qubit control. So this is all happening again with these two voltages that are just changing the positions of our atoms. So in effect, all of the physical qubits are receiving the same instruction and acting like one big atom. And putting these tools together, the device looks something like this. So we have a zoned architecture where we have a place where qubits, logical qubits can be stored, where they can be entangled using these transversal gates, and finally where they can be read out by just measuring the physical qubits that are a part of the logical qubit. And this is really, in some ways, reminiscent of early CPU architectures where we have different parts of the processor doing different operations, but only with, again, a few control knobs. I'm gonna pause here to see if there are any questions. Yeah.
Slightly off topic, but why rubidium?
Why rubidium? Rubidium is not the only choice. There's lots of groups across the country and the world that are exploring different atoms. Rubidium's nice in that it has a single valence electron, and that's a really natural qubit, is just the state of that electron. But other hydrogen-like atoms are also really good, and then people are exploring other different types of atoms as well. So there's really a lot of stuff you can play around with. It's pretty interesting, actually. Yeah. More questions? Well, I'll keep going. So let's look at how we do transverse circuits with transversal gates in the lab. So to start out, we need to pick an error correcting code. And each code has a certain set of logic gates that it can perform transversely. Turns out it can't perform all of them transversely, but we can still use these transversal gates to do interesting computations. So 2D codes, such as the surface code, and also there's a type of 2D color codes, have transversal Clifford gates. What is a Clifford gate? You can think of it on the single qubit level as being able to prepare kind of 90-degree angles on the block sphere. So for example, Hadamard and S gates, well, Hadamard gates, which are Clifford, will take you from plus Z to plus X. Oop, should be X, not Y. And then phase will take you from Y to X. And we also have a C0 gate, which will allow us to entangle different logical qubits. So we can use these gates to really easily generate interesting logical entangled states in the lab. So for example, here we have a circuit that is preparing a Schrodinger cat state, an entangled state between 4 different color code logical qubits, and we'll do it by first encoding our qubits, our physical qubits, in a color code state using some circuit. We'll use transversal C0s to basically prepare the top half with lower noise than the bottom half. Don't worry about the details. And then we'll do logic gates to entangle the remaining qubits to generate our cat state. And again, this is a video of what it looks like in the lab. So we have the first layer of gates that are preparing our codes. Then now you're seeing the first C0 to prepare the top half fault tolerantly. And then we're going to have 2 layers of C0 gates, again, to entangle the logical qubits. So one of the most simple proofs of concept that we can do armed with these transversal gates now is to, if you recall this we can study the so-called threshold theorem that I mentioned at the beginning of the talk, where basically we'll change the code distance and see if we can reduce our logical error rate. And we'll do this by preparing a bell pair between two surface codes, so entangling them. So first, we'll prepare the surface codes in logical plus or 0 by initializing physical qubits in the same state and then measuring our stabilizers using this ancilla readout circuit. Then we'll entangle them using this transversal. Oh, yes, question.
What does it mean to check for parity in qubits when you're talking about a cat state? Because wouldn't that collapse like a superposition when you're doing the measurement?
Oh, great question. Very important distinction. So this cat state is a cat state of logical qubits. Each logical qubit is comprised of physical qubits, and that's what we're checking the parities on. We're checking the parities of physical qubits to detect errors on the logical qubit. Yeah, so when we want to probe the fidelity of this state, we're going to basically measure it in different bases and then reconstruct the logical values of that circuit. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think.
Of course. More questions? Great. All right. So yeah, once we're done with our transversal C0, now on this bell pair, we'll basically measure out all of our data qubits in our logical code block, and we'll use those measurements to figure out what was the logical operator, which I can just reconstruct by looking at my physical data qubit measurements. What are my stabilizers in order to do error detection and correction? And in order to probe this threshold behavior, I'll increase my code distance from 3 all the way to 7 in order to see if we can reduce our logical error probability. So in order to look at the fidelity or how well we've prepared our state, we'll basically measure it in different bases in order to see that we reconstruct the right expectation values of our different logical operators. So here is for distance 7. We have roughly 95% populations in logical 0, 0, and 1, 1, which is exactly what you would hope for if you're preparing a bell pair, which is 0, 0 plus 1, 1. And similarly in the X basis. And furthermore, what we see is that as we increase our distance, we reduce the logical error rate of our logical bell pair. Now, one interesting thing that I want to note here is that the only way that we were able to see this below threshold behavior is if we used a kind of new technique to decode our logical qubits, where instead of looking at the stabilizers of a given logical qubit and deciding a correction, we're rather going to look at the stabilizers of both logical qubits that have done a gate together and assign a correction to both of them at the same time. Now, why do we do this? Well, when we have transversal gates, we're interacting our two code blocks, and we can transfer errors in between the code blocks as a result. So for those of you that are familiar, an poly X error will be copied from control to target. Poly Z will be copied from target to control. And as a result, we can do a lot better job when we interpret our logical bell pair by accounting for these correlated errors between the two code blocks. And it turns out that such correlated decoding actually can be used to substantially reduce the resource cost of these types of circuits that we're looking at. And I'm not sure if I'll have time at the end, but that's okay. So I just want to mention that here. It's actually a really important result that can allow us to do computation a lot more efficiently. So this is really a hallmark of quantum error correction, that we can see this threshold theorem for the circuit that we're interested in. There's a caveat here that I just want to mention, which is that the threshold for this circuit is higher than we would get if we ran a really long circuit. Shorter circuits tend to have higher thresholds if they're, pretty short. And future research should really explore deep circuits, but it's pretty nice that we can already see this threshold theorem in the lab today. So the next question that we can ask is, how do I take these basic building blocks of transversal gates and now apply them to realizing interesting algorithms? Yeah.
You said that that you couldn't always do the transversal thing. Are there limitations here? You can't use, can you do everything you want to do is basically what I want to ask you.
Great question. So there is a limitation. I'm actually going to talk about next.
Okay, cool. Awesome.
Yeah, I'll hold off because it'll be on the next slide, actually.
Okay.
Okay, so let's apply these tools to algorithms. So we really need to start thinking about how can we use these basic tools to realize complex quantum algorithms in practice. And in order to do this most efficiently, what we'll do is take into account our hardware, our error correcting code, and the way we do gates, and really try and co-design them with the algorithm that we want to implement. Because for a different algorithm, there might be better or worse strategies to doing quantum error correction, and we really want to minimize the resources that we need. And so I'm going to show an example of how this works in practice. Suppose that we want to generate a really complex quantum state. So far we've explored two-dimensional codes, which have transversal Clifford gates, if you remember. But Clifford gates, you can actually prove that they can be simulated classically. All of the kind of complexity of quantum computation is due to non-Clifford so-called magic states. And basically these magic states will take you away from these kind of 90-degree angles on the Bloch sphere and allow you to explore the whole Hilbert space of not just a given logical qubit, but also combined with an entangling gate, the whole Hilbert space of your many-body system. And you can show, at least in most constructions, how to do error correction, generating universal quantum computation, where you need both Clifford and non-Clifford gates, is super expensive. And the reason is exactly what your question was about. It's due to the fact that we can't realize all our gates transversally. We never have both Clifford and fully non-Clifford gates that are available to us transversally. So one gate will be hard. And so the question that we're going to ask here is, if we are less general, we don't try and do universal quantum computation, but rather we really focus on realizing a given algorithm. Can we generate many body states, for example, with lots of this quantum magic? And the answer is actually yes. And it's by switching out our error correcting code from a two-dimensional code to a three-dimensional code. So the code that we'll be looking at today it's called an 832 code. It basically means that we're encoding 3 logical qubits into 8 physical qubits. And the 2 is that it's distance 2, which means that we can detect a single error. And you can visualize this code on a 3D cube where the vertices are the physical qubits, and then the faces and edges are our logical X and Z operators. And once you go to higher dimensions, you get a different set of transversal gates. So instead of now having all of our Clifford gates transversally, we now unlock a non-Clifford transversal gate called the CCZ gate. And you can do it by applying physical T or 45-degree rotations on the Bloch sphere. So that's great. We now have a complex transversal gate. And we also get a lot of Clifford gates as well. So we have CZ gates and C0 gates that will entangle our logical qubits as well. But I want to point out here, we do not have a universal gate set. We've lost our Hadamard, if you remember from earlier. But luckily with these gates, we can start to realize really interesting many-body states. So here's a circuit that we're going to be running. And this circuit will simulate fast information scrambling on our logical qubits. Scrambling just means that we are going to rapidly entangle the logical operators of our qubits. So we can do this by first preparing our logical qubits in the plus state. Then we'll do layers, alternating layers of intra-block CCZ and CZ gates, so within a hypercube. And then we'll entangle different code blocks using C0 gates between blocks. And we'll do this on and then we'll measure in the X basis to kind of sample the wave function that we generated. And we'll do these entangling C0 gates between different code blocks on a hypercube connectivity. Why? Well, one, it looks cool, and two, it will really rapidly scramble my quantum information. And this circuit actually implements a famous class of circuits called instantaneous quantum polynomial circuits, where all you need to know is that they are scrambling circuits that are actually classically hard to simulate if we scale to large enough system sizes. So in order to probe the output of our quantum circuit that we're running, we're going to sample its output distribution. And by this, I mean we're going to measure, and then we're going to look at snapshots of this many body wave function in the basis that we're measuring. And we're going to compare it against the expected distribution obtained from simulations. Although these circuits are classically hard, at the sizes that we're at, they can still be simulated. So here is a plot showing the distribution of logical bit strings for 12 logical qubits. And what you can see if you look at this is if I start at my raw bit string distribution and then start using the error detecting capability in my code, I eventually better and better reproduce the ideal measurement distribution that I get from simulations. And so we can see that we can use this error detection in order to do a better and better job of sampling a very complex state in our hello space. And you can quantify this by looking at the overlap with the ideal distribution, quantified by this so-called XEV score, it's a score of how well you sample. And what we can see is that as we, oh yeah, question.
Can you quickly refresh me? What are you post-selecting on there? Post-selected, right?
Yeah, so we're using, so this code will detect a single error. So we're basically looking, and if our stabilizer is -1, we're going to throw away that shot. Yeah, and in practice, what we're doing is a sliding scale post-selection. So this circuit has 12 logical qubits. And so each shot, I'm going to see a certain number between 0 and 12 that have had an error. And so basically, these different lines are post-selecting on having fewer and fewer errors on those 12 logical qubits. Yeah. Yeah. Any more questions? Cool.
Okay, maybe one last one.
Yeah.
So with this code, you can do error detection, but because the distance is not 3, you cannot handle the direction.
Right.
Right, okay, good.
Yeah.
Okay,
Distance 2 means just one error can be detected. It's a very small code.
Okay, perfect.
Yeah.
Why have you given up the Hadamard gate with the cube structure?
Oh, great question. It's actually subtle. So what is a transversal Hadamard? We have to take logical X to logical Z and vice versa. And we're going to do it by applying Hadamards on all the physical qubits. But one way, what this means is that when I apply Hadamard, I take X to Z, but in order for this to really work transversally, X and Z have to lie on top of each other. They have to be in the same spot, which you actually only get if you have a 2-dimensional code. Yeah, you can't get it with 3D codes. Yeah, there's a whole side note, there's a whole fun sub-community that's just about designing cool QEC codes with cool gates. And I think it's actually a pretty interesting idea to try and design a new code that fits the algorithm that you want to run. People haven't really been exploring this yet. Okay, so let's look at how this scales to larger systems now. So we were looking at 12 logical qubits, but because we are really efficiently storing 3 logical qubits into 8 physical qubits, we can actually go to significantly larger system sizes, and we'll be able to run up to 48 logical qubit circuit which I showed here. And so here I'm plotting the sampling score as a function of the number of logical qubits that we're looking at. And I want to point out a few things. So the first is that if we use error detection, so this is comparing the red line to the green line, we significantly improve our sampling score. We have better and better overlap with the ideal distribution, which is great. Error detection is working. Furthermore, it's working so well that our sampling score that we get with logical qubits and using error detection is better than the best we could do with physical qubits. So already we're seeing a benefit to doing encoded computation on our logical qubits, which is pretty cool. So to summarize, the way that we think about our quantum architecture and how we design it to work with error-corrected computation can substantially reduce the resources that we need to do logic gates. And here in the atom array platform, we're really utilizing this ability to control blocks of atoms in parallel in order to realize these super easy transversal logic gates. And I'm actually not going to have time for the next part of my talk, but that's okay because I can explain it at a high level. Maybe I'll tell you the result, and then I'm happy to answer questions after about the details. So what's nice about our group is that we're half theorists, half experimentalists. I'm a theorist, but because we work so closely together, there's a lot of really good interplay between the two where we are deciding what's the best way to run circuits, and they're working with that too, and there's kind of a back and forth. And so actually this idea of using transversal gates, where we just basically perform gates in quick succession, was really formalized as a result of this collaboration, which was super fun. So I want to just explain at a high level the result. So now let's transition to thinking about running a really large-scale algorithm. When we run a large-scale algorithm and want to do all these universal gates and stuff, you run into many challenges, and one is that you need a larger code distance in order to protect yourself against errors better than better. And in the way that people traditionally think of doing error-corrected computation, after each logic gate, you're going to basically learn your stabilizers with high accuracy in order to figure out what error occurred. And so in practice, this is done again using this faulty measurement circuit, where we'll map the value of our stabilizer onto an ancilla qubit and read it out to figure out what errors occurred. So initially we might see, +1, no errors occurred, great. But this is the wrong thing to do. And it's because if I repeat it, I might get inconsistent results. And this inconsistency is due to the fact that when I measure my stabilizers, I'm doing a bunch of gates which are themselves faulty. And so it's difficult to know if we actually didn't have an error occur, or if I did have an error occur, and then also I just measured my stabilizer wrong. And if we want to get this threshold theorem, we need to suppress errors better with growing code distance, which means that we need, well, in principle, we need to learn our stabilizers better with growing distance. And in practice, this means measuring our stabilizers on the order of d times. Now, this is a major issue when we think about computing on large scales, because if I want to run a factoring algorithm or simulation of a quantum system, I need a code distance of roughly 30 in order to get a low enough error rate. And that means that each logic gate is requiring roughly 100 physical gate layers. And that's coming from basically repeating this faulty circuit roughly 30 times. And so intuitively, this process is ensuring, it's proving that we can confidently correct each logic gate independently. But what we did is we thought about if we could relax this requirement by, instead of trying to correct each gate on its own, really consider the fault tolerance of the algorithm as a whole. What does it mean to actually correct computations in an algorithm? And I won't go into it, but what we realized when we were doing the experiments is that you actually never need this repetitive syndrome extraction in practice when you're using these transversal gates. And the way that you can get away with not needing all this repetitive syndrome extraction is exactly this correlated decoding that I mentioned earlier, where basically we're going to use information on the stabilizers of all our qubits in order to assign a correction. And what we find and prove is that if we leverage these transversal gates and use this correlated decoding technique, we can reduce the gate depth of a logical gate from order of D to order of 1, which will reduce in practice the gate depth by 1 to 2 orders of magnitude when we think about the large scale. So that was a really exciting theory outcome of these experimental explorations. I won't go too into details. It's also a little technical, so it can be boring. So sorry, I use a lot of animations. Okay, cool. So I'll wrap up now. And what I'll say is that I think it's a really exciting time for the field. It's a really exciting field where there's, I mean, just by judging by the audience, there's an overlap between many different fields of science and engineering. And in the next few years, we will likely be able to, using these tools of control that I mentioned earlier, be able to start exploring circuits with potentially hundreds of logical qubits. And so what I think is really interesting to think about in the future is once we have these devices that can have, say, 10,000 atoms, which is it's likely going to happen in the next year or two, to be honest. How do we start thinking about computation on larger and larger scales? And there's so many exciting theory developments in the past few years that show that we can significantly cut these overheads. And I think people need to take these ingredients and start compiling them into interesting algorithms. So just to mention a few, there's these, I mentioned picking your error correction code based on the algorithm you want to run. There's error correcting codes that encode a ton of logical qubits into just a few physical qubits. But no one's really thought about how do we do computation with these codes. And there's also a lot of super exciting developments in the field on how we generate a universal gate set beyond just transversal gates. So to summarize, I already explained the hardware, but what we've also been able to show is that if we think about the kind of minimal requirements to perform logical computation, we can also reduce that resource overhead both in theory and in practice. And to sum up, I would like to first acknowledge my theory collaborators. So Harry, Dolev, and Chen are some of my closest collaborators, and I want to especially point them out. This work would not have been possible without them. And I'd also like to thank Alex Kubica, Arthur Jaffe, and Misha Lukin. Misha's my advisor, as well as the other theory collaborators in this work. And I would also like to thank the very large experimental team whose work I talked about. So they're here on the top. And then this is also a part of a much larger collaboration between 3 PIs as well as a very large theory team as well. So with that, I'm happy to take any last questions.
Any questions? I'll get started with one. So today, as a computational scientist, if I want to run an experiment in one of the popular available architectures, could be Quera, could be IBM, could be others. When I send over my circuit to be run, on their side, they don't do any quantum error correction, at least as far as I know.
Yeah.
So today, it's kind of the scientist's responsibility to do the error correction.
Yes.
At some point in the past, it was the scientist's responsibility to also do a noise mitigation. To some degree, it still is.
Same thing.
But some they do. Do you think that some point not too far down the line we'll reach a point where the person trying to run an experiment, maybe a chemist or physicist that honestly is not up there thinking about things, will benefit from quantum error correction without having it to code it themselves? How far are we from that?
How far, okay, so what I'll say is that companies now are already trying to do this. In my opinion, it's a little bit premature because we're a long ways off from running these really large scale algorithms. And so I think that these compilers that put everything in error correcting code are nice, but maybe we need to scale the platform a little bit more for it to really be useful. All of the results I showed today, the reason that they work so well is because we were thinking really carefully about what's the best way to do error correction. And I don't think we're at a scale where we just don't have to think about that anymore.
And maybe on that note, is there a go-to error correction code that you would suggest to someone who's just trying to get a result out on a computer, say, well, you know, without necessarily thinking about tailoring something to a specific experiment, at least try this one for any specific architecture if you want to comment?
Yeah, so the go-to code is, most people would say the surface code. Why? Super simple, really high threshold. And a lot of these platforms that I talked about, like superconducting qubits, for example, are actually, they're restricted to be in 2 dimensions. They don't have this reconfigurability. So there you have to use a surface code. You need to be on a 2D plane.
Mm-hmm.
So everyone thinks about their surface codes. That's my short answer.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I'm intrigued by you mentioned this correlated decoding.
Yeah.
You said you want to correct the algorithm or correct linear correcting code that depends on the algorithm. Just intuitively thinking, it feels like it's a bit cyclic in the sense that it feels like you have to a priori know the result of the algorithm to know how to correct it. Kind of more global sense.
I see.
I am sure it doesn't actually run into that, given the right cycles to like intuitively does.
Yeah. Well, maybe I'll just, so you said something about needing to know the results of the algorithm in order to assign a correction.
Right.
So the way that you get around this in general, this is not just specific to correlated decoding, is that in order to assign a correction, you only use your stabilizers. You're only using that information to figure out what went wrong. And then once you fix all the stabilizers, then you can look at what is my logical operator of my code. And that, once you've done the corrections, that'll be the output of your quantum computation. And you don't know that until you decode the stabilizers. But to decode the stabilizers, you don't have to simulate anything. The basic idea of decoding is that you're finding a likely error that could have produced your stabilizer measurements. You can almost think of it as an optimization algorithm. Yeah, and in this analogy, the only thing about correlated decoding is that it allows you to, well, there's multiple things, but at a high level, it allows you to do a better job at this optimization problem. Yeah. It allows you to find a more likely error by accounting for correlations. Yeah. Any more questions?
Can I ask one more thing?
Yeah.
There are a lot of haters out there when it comes to all the different architectures.
Yeah.
I'm a neutral atom guy myself, as it happens, but I want to know, if people say, they talk about the limitations. I'd like to hear from you, someone who really works with it. What do you think are going to be the limitations of the neutral atom stuff as you scale up?
Oh, great question. There's many that we need to address. One is, so remember these videos of the atoms moving? Okay, that was not real-time speed. It's not that slow. But
yes.
Atoms are actually slow compared to other platforms. So currently the movement takes a few hundred microseconds, which is pretty slow compared to other platforms like superconducting qubits, where it's more like nanoseconds. So that's one thing that people will address. I'm not too worried. Actually, our TA in the class that y'all took last semester is the expert on this, Dolev. And another that I think people don't think about a lot, but is eventually going to be needed to be dealt with, is we're entangling our atoms by shining a laser on them, and then that laser does a gate. But in practice, how quickly you can generate entanglement is limited by how wide this laser is. And you can't just keep getting a bigger and bigger laser due to reality. So that's another problem, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Was there another question? Yeah,
Yeah, is there any like utility or interest in making codes with larger gauge groups? 'Cause
larger
These are all
gauge.
G2 codes, right?
Oh, you're asking like a qubit or something? Or what do you mean by gauge group, I guess?
So like the torque code and the surface code are like Z2 gauge theories, right?
I see. Are you talking about like gauge operators where there's basically extra degrees of freedom?
Yeah.
Okay. And you're asking what's the benefit of that?
Well, I mean, all the ones that I'm familiar with, admittedly, I don't do polymer correction, but all the ones I know are all Z2 theories. So
There
like,
are others.
yeah,
They're called subsystem codes, and you do unlock cool new things when you use them. I'm not I know a bit, but I'm not a super expert. But you can do things like, for example, there's a 3D surface code that if you gauge fix, you can go down to a 2D surface code, but once you go to 3D, you get new transversal gates. So there's all sorts of fun things like that that you can start playing around with.